I am optimistic. I'm generally a very optimistic person.
This morning, Prince William sharing some rare personal insights with Eugene Levy.
In the final days before Christmas, Prince William uncovered a betrayal so intimate, so strategically concealed, that even senior courtiers admit they never saw it coming. What he exposed inside the royal household 5 minutes ago has already reshaped alliances and shattered others. And tonight, for the first time, the full extent of the deception can be told. The quiet rift before the storm. In the earliest days of December, when the mornings were still dark at 7:30 and Windsor's lawns held the first brittle frost, Prince William began to sense the quiet shift. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was not even something that could be easily articulated. But in palaces where silence speaks, where doors open a little too slowly, and where staff bow a fraction too long, intuition is often the first warning. On the morning of December 3rd, inside Kensington Palace's private study, William reviewed a briefing prepared for his upcoming environmental engagements. A thin document, scarcely 15 pages, yet riddled with details that felt unfamiliar, mismatched, or strangely rearranged. It was nothing overt, just an emphasis shifted here, a reference omitted there, the kind of tampering that could evade notice unless one had spent decades reading palace documents with the same scrutiny a surgeon gives a heartbeat. He set the papers down, his fingertips resting on the corner, and let the room settle around him. The old radiator beneath the window shuddered to life. Outside, London buses hummed distantly along Kensington Road. Everything appeared normal, and that, he realized, was the problem. The palace had become too quiet. Over the past fortnight, senior aides had been deferring meetings with unusual frequency, not canceling outright, merely nudging appointments to another hour, another afternoon, another day. A subtle rearranging of palace rhythms. Visitors who once approached him openly now engaged in brief, clipped consultations behind closed doors before speaking to him. Even the private secretaries, usually brimming with precision, began presenting summaries that carried a faintly passive tone, as if they were describing events from a distance rather than reporting the reality of what had transpired in the household. Princess Anne was the first to mention it aloud. During a short family meeting at Clarence House on December 5th, she stood at the edge of the room, wrapped in her usual no-nonsense winter coat, the color of storm water, and said, "Something is off, William. You can feel it too, can't you?" He had looked at her, and the answer was already in his eyes. Anne had sensed it as well, and if Anne sensed something, it was a matter not to be dismissed. By the time he returned to Kensington Palace that evening, the December dusk had settled into a cold blue haze. His security briefings were late, communications logs were inconsistent, and two of his most trusted aides, people who had worked with him since the early years after university, seemed noticeably anxious in his presence. They were polite, loyal, and articulate, but something in their movements betrayed them. A glance exchanged between them as they entered the room, a hesitation before answering even the simplest questions. William knew the palace had endured waves of instability in recent weeks, the late November fallout involving senior relatives, the multiple public clarifications that had become necessary, the internal restructuring that inevitably followed moments of crisis. But this felt different. This was not external pressure. This was internal alteration. Information was shifting before it reached him. And when information shifts, power shifts with it. The next morning at precisely 8 o'clock, a courier delivered a sealed red folder meant for William's eyes only. The contents were baffling. Statements he had never approved were marked as pending his signature. Adjustments to charitable schedules were attributed to his internal requests he had never made. Briefings for the king were stamped with approval blocks bearing his initials, though he had never seen them before. This was no clerical error, it was orchestration. William closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, he felt the unmistakable scent of betrayal, muted, deliberate, carefully positioned. The palace had weathered storms of public speculation, media intensities, and family fractures. But those challenges came from outside. An internal breach, one tailored so precisely it altered the direction of communication at the highest levels, was an entirely different kind of threat. He needed to trace the shift, quietly, thoroughly, without alerting the wrong person or, perhaps more dangerously, the right one. And by the end of that day, he would take the first step toward discovering a truth that had been buried beneath layers of hierarchy, loyalty, and carefully curated palace decorum. The betrayal had already begun, the fracture in the chain of trust. By December 6th, William's suspicions had grown from a faint suggestion to a structured pattern. He had spent the previous evening reviewing archival communications from mid-November and cross-referencing them with the documents he received during the first week of December. The discrepancies were undeniable. Details were being altered, narratives were being shaped, and the shaping was intentional. The Prince of Wales summoned his most discreet aide, a man who had served the crown since the early 2000s, known for his precision and his uncompromising discretion. They met in a small, rarely used conference room on the second floor of Kensington Palace, a room chosen precisely because it contained no official equipment, no digital connections, nothing that could be monitored without physical presence. "What you are about to see," William said quietly, sliding 2 folders across the table, "cannot leave this room." The aide nodded once methodically, then opened the first folder. His brow tightened. He opened the second folder and inhaled sharply. This is not an administrative error," he murmured. "No," William replied. "This is control." The aide did not ask who might be responsible. Asking would have suggested a level of uncertainty that neither man could permit. Instead, he began outlining procedures, informal ones, used only in circumstances where palace communications posed risks to senior members of the royal family. These procedures had been utilized perhaps 3 times in nearly 40 years. Once in the late 1970s, once in the mid-1990s, and once shortly after the transition of a monarch. "We start with the physical chain of custody," the aide said. "Every document that reaches your Royal Highness must be accounted for, not only who delivers it, but who touched it last." "And the digital chain?" William asked. "That," the aide replied, "is where this becomes interesting." Digital logs indicated that several key documents had been accessed, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours after their final review, but before their scheduled delivery. Accessed from inside the palace. Accessed using clearance levels reserved only for the highest strata of internal staff. And someone had used those clearance levels to distort William's directives. Princess Anne reappeared in his orbit later that afternoon. She was direct as ever. "You're investigating something," she said, stepping into the corridor outside his private office. "I can see it in your posture. What have you found?" He handed her a single page, only the page that proved a discrepancy in his schedule was submitted for approval without his consent. Anne read it once, slowly, then folded it back into his hand. "William," she said, lowering her voice, "this is not incompetence. Someone benefits from this, someone very close." Her warning lingered with him through the evening, through the late-night briefing that arrived nearly an hour behind schedule, through the strange quiet that had settled across the upper floors of Kensington Palace. When he met with the king on December 7th, the tension had already reached its strains. Charles had noticed changes in the tone of William's communications. Not what was said, but how it was framed, odd phrasing, softened warnings, unexplained deviations. "Your tone has felt different," Charles told him gently. "Measured, detached." "It was not my tone," William replied, and Charles, hearing the steady conviction in his son's voice, leaned back with a weariness born of decades spent navigating palace currents. "Find the truth," the king said, "whatever it costs. This family cannot sustain another internal deception." That blessing, quiet, restrained, unmistakably paternal, gave William the space he needed. By the time the December sun dipped behind the palace walls that day, he knew one thing for certain. The betrayal ran deeper than a single altered document. It was systemic, it was coordinated, and it was coming from inside the chain of trust that had been built over generations. The fracture had begun. A hidden network of quiet sabotage. The next 48 hours revealed more than anyone could have anticipated. William and his aide examined the patterns of briefings, the timestamps of revisions, The flow of information between Clarence House, Buckingham Palace, and Kensington Palace. A map began to form, subtle at first, then increasingly clear. Someone within the inner household had inserted themselves into the communication pipeline, altering the direction of information at critical moments. Late-night access to secure documents, unusual print requests during off hours, a cluster of communications routed through devices ordinarily used only during state emergencies, a detail so obscure that only a handful of senior aides would even recognize its significance. It was sabotage, executed quietly, with the finesse of someone who understood palace operations intimately. William spent the evening of December 8th reviewing every file modified between November 22nd and December 5th. What he discovered chilled him. Several key reports sent to the king had been softened. His warnings about international engagements had been minimized. His requests for clarity regarding security operations were reframed as suggestions rather than directives. But the most alarming discovery was the set of documents prepared for his own viewing, documents that had been manipulated to create the impression that certain decisions had originated from him, when in truth they had been engineered to distance him from the king. The intent was unmistakable: to weaken William's internal authority, to distort his voice, to fracture the alignment between father and son at one of the most sensitive chapters of the monarchy's modern era. At 9:30 that evening, one of the palace's longest-serving courtiers approached William discreetly just outside the private library. "You should know," the courtier whispered, "there have been unusual movements on the upper floor, files borrowed from the restricted archive, not by archivists." "Who?" William asked. The courtier hesitated, a dangerous hesitation, the kind that revealed fear rather than uncertainty. "Someone who believes they are untouchable." That single sentence altered William's entire perspective. Someone close, someone with power, someone who understood the household's vulnerabilities. As the night deepened, William walked the quiet halls of Kensington Palace alone. The portraits of kings and queens that lined the walls seemed to watch with muted intensity, their painted eyes reflecting centuries of crisis, betrayal, and fragile survival. He thought of his grandmother, who had once told him, when he was barely a teenager, "The danger is rarely the loud one, William. The danger is the quiet voice that whispers behind the curtain." Now he finally understood. This betrayal had been years in the making, not weeks. It had been planted, nourished, and finally activated at a moment when the monarchy was already straining under public pressure and shifting generational responsibilities. And someone inside his own household had orchestrated it. By midnight, the network had become clear, not just one individual. A small cluster, 2 aides, possibly a third, operating under one central figure who had access to the most sensitive communications in the royal system. And that central figure was someone William had once trusted implicitly. The betrayal comes into focus. On December 9th, the truth could no longer be kept at the edges of implication. That morning, William received a courtesy briefing prepared for an upcoming meeting with Commonwealth representatives, except the document bore striking similarities to another briefing he had already rejected 2 weeks earlier. It was almost identical, save for the fact that certain inflammatory remarks had been subtly reinserted, poised to create diplomatic tension if read aloud. That was when William realized the saboteur was not simply undermining him internally. They were positioned to provoke an international misstep, a misstep that could weaken the monarchy at a fragile moment. When Anne arrived at Kensington Palace shortly after noon, William handed her the altered briefing. She read it silently, her jaw tightening with every paragraph. "This is deliberate," she said, "and it is dangerous." She looked up. "You know who this points to, don't you?" William nodded once, not out of certainty, but because his instincts had already settled on the possibility. A senior aide within the household, someone who had served both the king and the prince, someone who understood the delicate balance between them, someone with enough institutional memory to weaponize the palace's own processes. That afternoon, the king summoned William to Clarence House for a private conversation. Charles sat at his desk, the December light filtering through the frosted windows, casting muted reflections across the room. He looked tired, though not defeated. "Anne has told me," he said quietly. "You believe there has been manipulation within our own walls." "I do," William replied, "and I believe the person behind it has acted for longer than any of us realized." Charles closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a resolve that reminded William of the man he had grown up watching, a monarch shaped by endurance. "We uncover the truth," Charles said, "even if it brings consequences we would rather avoid." The confrontation unfolded that evening. William requested a meeting with the individual at the center of the suspicion. They arrived in his office at 6:15, their posture confident, their tone almost rehearsed. For several minutes they spoke in circles, referencing procedural misunderstandings, clerical anomalies, shifts in staffing that could have caused confusion. But William had come prepared. Piece by piece he presented the evidence, the altered documents, the digital login histories, the timestamps revealing after-hours access to files that should have remained untouched. With every page he laid before them, their expression shifted, first to defensiveness, then irritation, then something colder. "You do not understand the pressures this household is under," they said finally. "I understand enough," William replied, "enough to know that trust has been violated." The aide's eyes narrowed. "You were not meant to find out this way." That sentence was the breaking point. Anne stepped into the room, then two senior courtiers, then security. The truth was no longer obscured. The betrayal was real, and the person responsible had been caught. 5 minutes ago, William reveals the truth. That was how recent the revelation was when the palace began bracing for the impact that would ripple across every corridor, every office, every schedule within the royal household. At precisely 7:05 on the evening of December 10th, Prince William exited the private council room of Kensington Palace, having concluded the most consequential internal meeting he had faced since becoming Prince of Wales. The confrontation had ended not with denial or confusion, but with confession. Quiet, calculated, chilling. The saboteur admitted to orchestrating the manipulation of communications between William and the king. Their motive, they claimed, was institutional rebalancing, a phrase that made seasoned aides recoil in disbelief. In their view, William had been moving too quickly, asserting direction, refining modern expectations, shaping the future of the monarchy with a clarity that unsettled those who preferred the familiar structures of past decades. They believed that by adjusting certain narratives, by slowing or redirecting William's initiatives, they were preserving what they saw as the traditional internal order. It was treachery disguised as preservation, manipulation cloaked as loyalty. Anne, standing beside William when the confession was delivered, said only 4 words, "This ends tonight, William." And so it did. Exactly 5 minutes ago, William notified the king of the full truth. Charles received the call in his private drawing room at Clarence House. Those present said the king closed his eyes and said nothing for nearly 10 seconds. Then, in a tone both saddened and resolute, he issued the directive that would remove the individual from their role, revoke their access to secure systems, and initiate a formal internal audit of every communication they had touched in the past 3 months. The palace had entered crisis response. Phones began ringing. Security teams repositioned. Private secretaries drafted emergency statements, though none would be released publicly unless absolutely necessary. The betrayal, while shocking, would remain internal unless circumstances forced disclosure. But the most striking detail was this. When William stepped out of the council room, the silence in the corridor broke instantly. Staff who had suspected something but lacked proof now realized the truth had surfaced. Conversations halted. Doors remained half open. Every person understood that the hierarchy of trust within the royal household had shifted in the space of 5 minutes. And William, with a steadiness inherited from generations before him, did not waver. "We move forward," he told the gathered aides. "We rebuild with clarity, no shadows." It was both an instruction and a vow, aftershocks across the crown. By the evening of December 11th, the palace had begun to feel different. Not repaired, not restored, simply quieter, the way a house sounds after a storm has passed, but before anyone dares to step outside to examine the damage. The advisory team met in one of the older rooms on the third floor of Buckingham Palace, a room seldom used except during moments of transition. The walls were lined with ledgers dating back to the early 20th century, each recording decades of state matters, family crises, wartime protocols, and private decisions that never reached the public. Now, new entries, painful ones, would soon join those volumes. Across the palace estate, staff walked with a careful restraint. They were professional, composed, and disciplined, yet beneath that surface lay the unmistakable tremor of a household that had just witnessed its own vulnerabilities exposed. Loyalty was not merely expected, it was being re-evaluated, measured, and reaffirmed. In a sense, everyone was taking inventory, not of documents, but of trust. By midday, Anne had compiled a 70-page internal assessment tracing every decision, every alteration, and every manipulated message that had passed through the compromised channels. Senior advisors said it was the most comprehensive internal review conducted since the transition of the crown. She placed the final page on the table and exhaled, a short, controlled breath that betrayed the strain of the past days. "We have to accept," she said softly to William, "that we overlooked something. Not through carelessness, through faith." Faith, as it turned out, had been both their strength and their vulnerability. Charles spent that afternoon beside the fireplace at Clarence House, consulting with longtime constitutional advisors. Not one of them could recall a moment in recent history where internal interference had been executed with such precision and such insight into the Crown's operational rhythm. This was not an ideological act, one advisor noted. It was strategic. Someone wanted to redirect the institution from within. Charles absorbed the words without comment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Those familiar with him knew that silence meant calculation, not defeat. There was a steadiness in him even now that reflected the decades he had spent preparing for moments exactly like this, moments where the monarchy needed not grandeur but governance. As for William, the consequences weighed on him differently. He had always understood the public duty, the scrutiny, the ceremonial gravity, but betrayal from within carried a sharper edge. It was a reminder that leadership was not only about vision or responsibility, it was about vigilance, about discerning whispers from warnings, about hearing what was not said, not written, not shown. And now, standing at the window of his Kensington study, he understood with stark clarity that the throne he would one day inherit required more than endurance. It required the ability to rebuild trust in a world where even the quietest breach could reverberate through the institution. He watched as the winter sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the gardens. The branches of the old elms trembled in the cold wind. He thought of the years ahead, years in which he would be expected to hold the monarchy steady while shaping it into something resilient enough for the modern world. The betrayal had changed him, not hardened him, refined him. Behind him, the door opened with a soft creak. It was Anne again, her face drawn not from fatigue, but from the weight of understanding. "You know what this means," she said quietly. "Yes," William replied. "It means we can no longer assume loyalty. We must confirm it." "And it means," she added, stepping closer, "that leadership begins long before the crown is placed. Tonight proves that more clearly than anything before." William nodded, not as a prince acknowledging an elder, but as a future king absorbing a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. By nightfall, the household had steadied. It had not healed, but it had steadied. Measures were enacted. Access was revoked. Systems were fortified. And for the first time in weeks, there was alignment, painful but pure. Yet even in that fragile stability, the emotional undercurrent remained. Because betrayal inside a family, especially one bound not by choice but by duty, left a mark deeper than any administrative report could capture. It lingered in conversations paused mid-sentence, in the quiet glances exchanged in the corridors, in the sudden awareness that every assumption about trust must now be reconsidered. Still, as the palace prepared for the nights ahead, a new resolve began to emerge. This was no longer about uncovering a saboteur. It was about ensuring the monarchy would never be vulnerable to this kind of deception again. And so, when William stood that night before the dimly lit hallway leading to his private rooms, he spoke a single sentence, to no one in particular, but with a conviction that filled the silence around him. This ends a chapter. It does not define the next. In the end, what unfolded inside those quiet palace walls was not simply a breach, nor an unfortunate misjudgment. It was a reckoning, one that revealed how fragile even the strongest institutions can become when shadows are allowed to grow unchecked. Today, William does not stand diminished. He stands sharpened, tempered by the realization that leadership is forged in the moments that never make the news, in the decisions made behind closed doors, and in the courage to expose the truth even when it fractures the illusion of unity. And though the crown carries on as it always does, its steadiness is now marked by this winter's quiet war, a battle fought not with declarations, but with stolen documents, altered narratives, and the whisper of betrayal carried through palace corridors. Because sometimes the greatest threats are not loud. They do not come from microphones or headlines or public scrutiny. They come from within, from those who believe they know better, who rearrange truth under the guise of protection. And as the household resets, as new protocols rise from the ashes of old assumptions, one truth remains unchanged. This time, the betrayal was exposed. Next time, with eyes now opened and walls fortified, it will never make it past the door. In the stillness that followed the investigation, as December's final days drifted toward the cold promise of a new year, the royal household found itself sitting between two worlds, the world it had been before the betrayal and the world it would now have to become. Change, once an unwelcome visitor in these historic halls, had arrived uninvited and settled itself firmly at the table, and strangely, there was clarity in the quiet. The palace no longer clung to the illusion that loyalty was automatic or unconditional. Instead, those who remained, those who had chosen service not as a stepping stone but as a calling, moved with renewed purpose. Every office glowed a little longer into the night. Every conversation carried more intention. Every document was read with the understanding that accuracy was no longer a courtesy but a promise. The crown had survived the week, but survival came with a cost. Prince William, though resolute, could feel the change inside himself as palpably as the winter air pressing against the Kensington windows. Betrayal does not merely expose weakness, it forces maturity, the kind one does not choose, the kind handed to them by circumstance, the kind that shapes kings. For the first time, he understood a truth that monarchs before him had learned in their own painful seasons. A crown is not inherited. A crown is earned through crisis, through vigilance, through the quiet courage to confront what others pretend not to see. And William had seen everything, not by desire but by necessity. He had watched faith distort into advantage. He had watched loyalty unravel into ambition. He had watched someone weaponize the very systems built to protect the monarchy. Yet through it all, he did not break. He did not retreat. He did not permit bitterness to seed itself in the soil of his judgment. Instead, he rose, measured, deliberate, changed but not diminished. It was Anne who articulated what the rest of the household already sensed. "You stepped into leadership this week in a way that cannot be undone," she told him one evening as they walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace. "You showed that the future of the crown is not fragile, not with you holding part of its weight." It was not praise, it was an observation. Charles, too, felt the shift. Though he kept his reflections private, those close to him noticed the subtle way he watched his son now, with a recognition that the mantle he would one day pass down had already begun to shape William into something steadier, more formidable, more ready. And so the betrayal, painful as it had been, became a pivot in the monarchy's long story. A reminder that even behind the gilded doors, humanity governs the institution, its strengths, its fractures, its capacity for both deception and redemption. The household would heal, yes, but it would not forget. Not this time. The lessons carved into these winter days would echo through future policies, future appointments, future crises. Nothing would be taken at face value again. And the systems once trusted to run on tradition alone would now run on scrutiny, accountability, and watchfulness. For in the end, it was not the saboteur's actions that defined the moment. It was the response. It was the unity forged in the aftermath, the honesty reclaimed, the truth unearthed despite every effort to bury it. As midnight settled over London and the lights across the palace grounds flickered one by one, a final, quiet understanding rose to meet the moment. The crown does not endure because it is ancient. It endures because in moments of fracture, someone chooses to stand firmly enough to hold the line. And this time it was William. He had walked into the storm with doubt, with suspicion, with the weight of expectations he never asked for. Yet he emerged carrying something far stronger than certainty. He emerged carrying authority earned through adversity. So as this chapter closes, this cold, brittle chapter of winter revelation, one truth stands taller than the rest. The betrayal did not weaken the monarchy. It strengthened the future king. And now, should deception ever again whisper through the palace halls, it will find a new reality waiting for it, a household awake, a prince unshaken. A monarchy is no longer blind to its shadows. This time, the betrayal was exposed. Next time, under William's watch, it will not survive the light.